She just sat in a chair all day, literally the most boring job in the military. My crypto portfolio is worth more than her entire pension. I didn't flinch. I took a sip of my beer, the same domestic brand I'd been drinking for 30 years, and watched the pregame coverage flicker across my brother's 65-inch television. Jason had no idea that the chair he was mocking sat 200 feet beneath the Wyoming prairie, surrounded by 8-foot concrete walls and enough firepower to end civilization 12 times over. But he would. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who couldn't comprehend your silence, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Agnes Thompson. I'm 54 years old. And up until 30 seconds ago, I was eating 7-layer dip at my brother's Super Bowl party like any other retired aunt visiting family. Now I'm watching my nephew perform for a room full of relatives who've spent the last decade believing I was a secretary in uniform. They don't know that yet. I learned the hard way that in the Thompson family, my silence was never seen as discipline, only proof that I had nothing interesting to say. The afternoon Jason first called my career glorified babysitting, something inside me shifted like a bone that never set right. Growing up in the Thompson household meant earning attention through volume. My brother Richard, Jason's father, had been the loud one, football captain, state sales manager, the son who filled every room he entered. I was the other one, the quiet child, too still, too watchful, too comfortable with silence. When Richard came home with trophies, I came home with library books about missile systems and Cold War strategy. When he announced his promotions at Christmas dinner, I mentioned I'd been reassigned and changed the subject. They hadn't just overlooked me, they'd rewritten me. In their version, I was the sister who did something with computers for the Air Force. The aunt who never married, never had kids, never did anything worth mentioning at family gatherings. The woman who sat in a chair somewhere and watched screens. They had no idea what those screens displayed. Richard's house sat on a cul-de-sac in suburban Phoenix, terracotta roof, 3-car garage, a pool that probably cost more than my first 5 years of military salary combined. The air conditioning hummed so aggressively that I'd kept my cardigan on since I arrived. Super Bowl Sunday, the one day a year I agreed to visit. I'd driven down from my small place in Flagstaff, a cabin really with a garden I'd been cultivating since retirement. No classified equipment, no blast doors, just tomatoes and silence and the occasional call from old colleagues who understood why I preferred it quiet. The house was already full when I arrived. Richard's wife, Deborah, had set out enough food to feed a battalion, wings, sliders, 3 different dips, a vegetable tray that no one would touch. Streamers and team colors hung from the ceiling fan. Agnes, Deborah had smiled tightly at the door. You made it. Richard wasn't sure you'd come this year. I'd handed her the potato salad I'd brought. Wouldn't miss it. That was a lie. I'd rather have been home with my dog and a book. But family was family, even when they didn't know who you really were. The living room held maybe 15 people, Richard's golf buddies, Deborah's sister, various neighbors whose names I'd forgotten. And in the center of it all, holding court by the big screen, Jason, 29 years old, hair styled with product that probably cost $30 an ounce, wearing a t-shirt that said decentralized across the chest in metallic letters. Jason had dropped out of college 6 years ago to revolutionize finance. From what I gathered, this meant staring at charts on his phone and occasionally losing significant amounts of his father's money on digital speculation. But he talked about it constantly, loudly, with the confidence of someone who had never been truly tested. And that's why traditional careers are dead, he was saying as I settled into a corner chair with my plate. My generation doesn't need pensions. We need liquidity, flexibility, the ability to move capital across borders in seconds. Richard beamed at his son. Kid's going to be a millionaire before he's 35. Already am, Dad. Paper millionaire, but still. Jason grinned. It's all about asymmetric risk profiles. I ate my 7-layer dip and said nothing. The game started at 4:30. By halftime, Jason had consumed 4 beers and pivoted from cryptocurrency to criticizing everyone else's career choices. He'd already dismissed his cousin Marcus's teaching job as government daycare and suggested that his Aunt Patricia's nursing career would be automated within 5 years. I knew I was next. I'd felt his attention shifting toward me throughout the first half. Glances, smirks, the particular energy of a young man who needed an easy target. Hey, Aunt Agnes. I looked up from my plate. Jason, I've always wondered something. He leaned against the wall, beer dangling from his fingers. What exactly did you do in the Air Force? Like, specifically? The room's background noise dimmed slightly. A few relatives turned, mildly curious. I adjusted my reading glasses. Missile operations, right. But what does that mean? He spread his hands theatrically. Like, you sat at a computer, watched some screens, made sure lights stayed green? Something like that. So basically, he paused for effect. Glorified babysitting. A few people chuckled. Richard smiled indulgently at his son. She just sat in a chair all day, Jason continued, warming to his audience. Literally the most boring job in the military. No offense, Aunt Agnes, but my crypto portfolio is worth more than your entire pension. I took a sip of my beer. 20 years, he pressed. 20 years of sitting in a chair watching screens. And now you grow tomatoes in Flagstaff. He shook his head with mock sympathy. That's the problem with government jobs. No upside, no equity. You trade your best years for a pension that inflation eats alive. Jason, Deborah murmured, but without conviction. What? I'm just being honest. He looked around the room. Someone should tell her. The world's changing. Sitting in chairs watching screens isn't a career anymore. It's what AI does. I folded my napkin beside my untouched second plate of wings. The doorbell rang. Richard frowned. Who's that? Game's on. Deborah moved toward the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of what was waiting on the porch, and my stomach tightened in a way it hadn't since my last active rotation. A black SUV in the driveway, government plates, 3 figures in dress uniforms standing in formation. The air conditioning seemed to quiet. Even the television commentary faded to white noise. Deborah opened the door and immediately stepped back, her expression shifting from hostess politeness to confusion to something approaching fear. Can I help you, ma'am? The voice was deep, formal, and carried the particular weight of military authority. We're looking for Colonel Agnes Thompson. We were informed she'd be at this address. The room went silent. 15 people turned to look at me, at the quiet aunt in the corner chair with the reading glasses and the cardigan and the plate of untouched chicken wings. I set down my beer. I didn't look at Jason. Not yet. The man in the doorway stepped inside, tall, silver-haired, wearing a colonel's eagles and more ribbons than anyone in that living room had likely seen in person. His gaze swept the room, found me, and locked on. Colonel Thompson. It wasn't a question. Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Colonel? I rose from my chair, straightening my cardigan. The movement was automatic, 30 years of muscle memory, spine straight, shoulders back, the posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms where posture meant something. Colonel Markham. I kept my voice level. I wasn't expecting you. No, ma'am, I imagine not. He crossed the room toward me, his boots silent on Richard's expensive carpet. The request came through this morning. Highest priority. I volunteered to deliver it personally. Request. Behind him, the 2 junior officers remained at attention by the door. Their eyes stayed fixed forward, professionally blind to the chaos their presence was creating in a suburban living room full of Super Bowl decorations. Jason hadn't moved. His beard dangled forgotten from his fingers, condensation dripping onto his mother's hardwood floor. Colonel Thompson, Markham said, stopping 3 feet in front of me. Do you remember November 1998, the Kilo 11 incident? The room seemed to tilt. November 1998. A night I had never discussed with anyone. A night that officially never happened. Yes, sir. My voice stayed steady. I remember. Then you'll understand why the president wants to thank you personally. Deborah made a small sound, half gasp, half question. Richard found his voice. The president of what? Markham didn't look at him. His attention remained fixed on me with the particular respect that only comes from shared knowledge, the kind of knowledge that never appears in official records. Ma'am, 26 years ago, you were the duty officer at Kilo 11 when a software malfunction generated a false positive indicating incoming Soviet missiles. He spoke clearly, ensuring the room could hear. Every protocol demanded you turn your key and initiate launch sequence. Every alarm in that bunker was screaming at you to end the world. I said nothing. My hands stayed at my sides. You refused. You identified the error. You contacted NORAD directly, bypassing your commanding officer, and prevented what would have been an accidental nuclear exchange with Russia. His voice hardened with something that sounded almost like awe. Your decision saved an estimated 400 million lives, minimum. The only sound was the muffled commentary from the television, where millionaires were throwing a ball back and forth. The incident was classified top secret. You were forbidden from discussing it. For 26 years, you've let your family believe you sat in a chair and watched screens. Markham shook his head slowly. You saved the world, Colonel, and you couldn't tell a soul. He stepped back. His right hand rose in a crisp salute. Behind him, the 2 junior officers followed suit, 3 military personnel in full dress uniform, saluting me in my brother's living room while the Super Bowl played on mute. The ceremony is in 2 weeks, Markham said, holding the salute. The White House. The president will award you the Medal of Freedom personally. A helicopter is standing by to escort you to the briefing. I returned the salute. The motion felt like coming home. When I lowered my hand, I finally let myself look at Jason. He had gone pale. The beer slipped from his fingers, spilling across the floor in a spreading puddle that no one moved to clean. His mouth worked silently. No words came. I walked toward the door, pausing beside him just long enough to pat his shoulder gently, the way you'd comfort a child who'd just learned something difficult. Enjoy the game, Jason? I didn't wait for a response. The February air hit my face as I stepped onto the porch, clean and sharp after the recycled chill of Richard's air conditioning. The black SUV gleamed in the driveway, its engine still running. 2 more officers stood beside it, hands clasped behind their backs. I stopped at the top of the steps. Behind me, the screen door hadn't closed. I could feel 15 pairs of eyes burning into my back, relatives frozen in various stages of disbelief, Super Bowl forgotten, 7-layer dip congealing on abandoned plates. Colonel. Markham appeared at my shoulder. Before we proceed to the briefing, I need to confirm something. I turned to face him. His gaze dropped to my cardigan, specifically to the small pin on my collar that I'd worn so long it had become invisible to me. Gray metal, barely half an inch across, no insignia, no marking. Most people who noticed it assumed it was decorative, a grandmother's brooch, something I'd picked up at a craft fair. Markham knew better. That pin, he said quietly. Kilo 11 duty officers received those after the 98 protocols were updated. Gray for the underground crews. Only 47 ever issued. I touched it without thinking. The metal was warm from my skin. 31 of those officers are deceased now, he continued. 8 are in care facilities. You're one of 9 still living who could answer the question I'm about to ask. Through the screen door, I heard movement, shuffling. Someone, Richard probably, approaching slowly, as if the porch had become foreign territory. Colonel Thompson. Markham's voice dropped lower. On November 14th, 1998, at approximately 0347 hours, the duty officer at Kilo 11 received a priority alpha alert indicating 12 inbound ICBMs from Soviet launch sites. Standard protocol required immediate key turn verification and launch authorization within 90 seconds. I said nothing. My hands stayed still at my sides. That duty officer refused. She identified anomalies in the satellite data, thermal signatures inconsistent with actual launches, trajectory calculations that violated basic physics. She contacted NORAD directly, bypassing her launch commander, and convinced them to delay response while she ran manual verification. The screen door creaked. Richard stood in the doorway, his face the color of old paper. The software malfunction was confirmed 18 minutes later, Markham said. A faulty sensor array had generated false positives across 3 monitoring stations simultaneously. If the duty officer had followed protocol, if she had turned her key, the United States would have launched a full retaliatory strike against Russia. The Russians would have responded in kind. He paused. Colonel Thompson, were you that duty officer? The question hung in the February air. I looked at Markham, at his ribbons, his eagles, the particular weight of knowledge in his eyes. Then I looked past him at Richard, frozen in the doorway, at the faces crowded behind him. Jason had pushed to the front. His earlier arrogance had collapsed into something raw and unguarded. He looked like a man watching his understanding of reality restructure itself in real time. Yes, sir, I said. I was. The screen door banged open. Richard stumbled onto the porch, Deborah and Jason close behind. The other relatives pressed against the windows like spectators at a zoo exhibit. Agnes? Richard's voice cracked. Agnes, what? I don't. He stopped, stared at the officers, stared at me. I'd seen that expression before. Not on my brother. I'd never seen anything but casual dismissal on Richard's face when he looked at me. But I'd seen it on other faces, in other contexts. The face of someone realizing they've been standing next to something dangerous without knowing it. 20 years, he managed. 20 years you sat at Christmas dinner and said nothing. You let us think. He gestured vaguely at my cardigan, my reading glasses, my sensible shoes. You let us think you were a secretary. I kept my voice even. I know what you thought. But why? Deborah stepped forward, her hostess composure finally cracking. Why didn't you tell us? We're family. We would have. You would have what? The question stopped her cold. Would have believed me? I shook my head slowly. Would have understood what it means to spend 20 years in a bunker 200 feet underground, knowing that your job is to end civilization if someone gives the order? Would have looked at me differently at Thanksgiving dinner, wondering if I was the kind of person who could turn a key and kill 400 million people? Deborah's mouth opened, closed. I was bound by classification, I continued. But even if I hadn't been, even if I could have told you everything, you wouldn't have wanted to know. It was easier to believe I was boring. Easier to let Jason mock the aunt who sat in a chair. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't need to. The truth, Richard, is that I sat in that chair with my hand on a key that could end the world. Every shift, for 20 years. And the hardest part wasn't the responsibility. It was coming home to a family that thought I was nothing. Markham cleared his throat softly. Colonel, the helicopter is standing by. I nodded, but I didn't move. Not yet. Jason had edged forward past his parents until he stood at the edge of the porch steps. His face had cycled through several emotions in the past few minutes: shock, denial, something that might have been shame. Now it settled on something I hadn't expected: fear. Aunt Agnes. His voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. The thing you said about the key, about ending civilization. I waited. You could have done it? Like, actually, if the alert had been real, the question deserved a real answer. I gave him one. Yes. He swallowed hard. And you just lived with that every day, knowing that you might have to. Yes. How? The word cracked. How do you live with something like that? I looked at my nephew, really looked at him, maybe for the first time, past the product in his hair and the crypto t-shirt and the desperate need to seem important, past the bravado and the mockery and the casual cruelty of someone who had never been tested. He was 29 years old. He had never held anything more dangerous than his father's money. The heaviest decision he'd ever made was which imaginary currency to bet on. And he genuinely wanted to understand. You don't live with it, Jason. I took off my reading glasses, cleaned them on my cardigan. You live beside it, you build a garden in Flagstaff and grow tomatoes and let your family think you're boring. Because if you talked about it, if you let yourself feel the weight of it every single day, you'd never be able to function. I put the glasses back on. You asked what I did for 20 years. The answer is I kept the world alive by being willing to end it. And then I came home and ate 7-layer dip and let you mock me because that was easier than explaining why I couldn't sleep without checking the news first. Jason's mouth trembled. His eyes were wet. I'm sorry. The words came out broken. Aunt Agnes, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. No, I cut him off, but gently. You didn't. I let that sit for a moment. You didn't know because you never asked. You never wondered why your aunt spent 30 years in uniform and never talked about it. You assumed that silence meant nothing worth saying. I shook my head. Some of the most important things in this world happen in silence, Jason. Underground, off the record, done by people who will never get credit and can never explain why they deserve it. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Your crypto portfolio, I said. The asymmetric risk profiles, the paper millions. He flinched. I sat in a chair for 20 years with the fate of human civilization in my hands. I made decisions in 90-second windows that your algorithms couldn't model in a lifetime. And when I got it right, when I refused to turn that key, even though every system was screaming at me to do it, nobody knew, nobody thanked me. I went home and ate breakfast and didn't tell a soul for 26 years. I stepped closer to him. That's asymmetric risk, Jason. Real risk. The kind where you can't cash out if you get it wrong because there's nothing left to cash out to. Markham touched my elbow. Ma'am, we really should go. I turned toward the SUV. The junior officers had already opened the rear door. Agnes. Richard's voice stopped me. He'd recovered enough to speak, though he still looked like a man who'd discovered his own house was built on a fault line. Are you coming back after the ceremony? I considered the question. The garden in Flagstaff needed tendings. The tomatoes would be ready for planting in a few weeks if the weather held. My dog was with a neighbor who'd watch her as long as needed. There was nothing for me in Phoenix except relatives who'd finally learned who I was and who would now spend every future gathering trying to reconcile the aunt they'd dismissed with the officer who'd saved the world. I don't know, Richard. I meant it. I don't know if I want to. His face crumpled slightly. You spent 30 years looking through me, I said. You let your son call my career babysitting in front of a room full of people, and you laughed. You never once asked what I actually did, because you'd already decided it didn't matter. I turned to face him fully. I'm not angry. I stopped being angry a long time ago, but I'm also not going to pretend that everything is fine now that you know the truth. The truth was always there. You just didn't want to see it. Deborah made a sound, something between protest and acknowledgement. If you want a relationship with me, I said, you'll have to build it. From scratch. As if you're meeting me for the first time, because in a way you are. I didn't wait for a response. I walked down the porch steps, past Jason still frozen in place, past the manicured lawn and the terracotta pots and the SUV with its government plates gleaming in the Arizona sun. Colonel Markham fell into step beside me. Ma'am, he said quietly. For what it's worth, I served under General Harrison during the Kilo 11 review. He told me once that what you did that night required more courage than any combat action he'd ever witnessed. I climbed into the SUV. The leather seats were cool and professional. He said you held your ground against two superior officers who were ordering you to turn your key, that you cited regulation discrepancies they didn't even know existed, that when they threatened court-martial, you told them. He paused, almost smiling. That you'd rather face a tribunal than explain to God why you ended the world over a software glitch. I looked out the window at Richard's house at the faces still pressed against the glass. I remember, I said. The door closed. The SUV pulled away from the curb, and I watched the cul-de-sac shrink in the rearview mirror. The perfect suburban tableau with its Super Bowl streamers and its 65-inch television and its crypto-trading nephew who'd just learned that his boring aunt had held the fate of civilization in her hands. Markham settled into the seat beside me. The ceremony is scheduled for 2 weeks from tomorrow, he said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. The president will present the Medal of Freedom in a private ceremony first, followed by a public statement. Your identity will remain classified, but your actions will be officially acknowledged for the first time. I nodded, only half listening. Through the tinted window, I saw Jason burst out the front door and run toward the street. He stopped at the edge of the lawn, watching the SUV disappear around the corner. His mouth was moving. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could guess. The helicopter lifted off from the Phoenix airfield at 18:47 hours. Below, the city sprawled in grids of light and shadow, swimming pools catching the last of the sunset, highways threading through suburbs like arteries through tissue. I watched it shrink beneath us and felt nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, just the particular emptiness that comes when something you've carried for decades finally sets down. Markham sat across from me reviewing documents on a tablet. The rotor noise made conversation difficult, which suited me fine. I'd said more in the past hour than I'd said in the past decade combined. My phone buzzed in my cardigan pocket. I didn't check it. I already knew who it would be. The briefing facility sat on a military installation I couldn't name. Not because I'd forgotten, but because some things stay classified regardless of circumstances. The building looked like every other government structure I'd spent my career inside. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, the particular smell of recycled air, and old coffee. Home. A young lieutenant met us at the entrance, snapping to attention when she saw my face. Colonel Thompson! Her voice carried genuine awe. Oh, it's an honor, ma'am. I studied the Kilo 11 protocols at the academy. What you did, Lieutenant? I kept my voice kind but firm. I appreciate the sentiment, but I was just doing my job. She nodded quickly, but her eyes said she knew better. They always did. The ones who understood what it meant to sit in those chairs, the weight of it, the terrible privilege of being trusted with that much destruction. The briefing room held 6 people. Markham, 3 Pentagon officials whose names I immediately forgot, a woman from the White House Communications Office, and General Patricia Holloway, the current commander of Air Force Global Strike Command. General Holloway rose when I entered. She was younger than me by at least a decade, but her eyes carried the same weight I saw in my own mirror. She'd sat in those chairs too, once, before the promotions, before the stars on her collar. Colonel Thompson. She extended her hand. I've waited a long time to meet you. I shook it. General. When I was a captain, I read the classified after-action report on Kilo 11. She gestured for me to sit. Changed how I thought about everything, about protocol, about courage, about what it really means to serve. I settled into a chair, my hands folded in my lap, the posture of 20 years underground. The report said you argued with 2 superior officers for 11 minutes while the countdown clock ran, Holloway continued. 11 minutes with nuclear launch authorization hanging in the balance. They were ready to have you arrested. They were following protocol, I said. I was following physics. You were following something else. Holloway's gaze held mine. Judgment. The kind that can't be trained into a person, the kind that either exists or doesn't. She pulled a folder from the stack in front of her. 26 years, Colonel. 26 years, and your file stayed buried in a vault somewhere because certain people decided the world wasn't ready to know how close we came. She shook her head slowly. 400 million lives, conservative estimate, and you went home and grew tomatoes. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. My phone buzzed 3 more times during the briefing. The ceremony details were straightforward. White House, private audience with the president, Medal of Freedom presented with full military honors. The public statement would acknowledge the incident without naming me specifically. A courageous officer whose quick thinking prevented catastrophe. Anonymous heroism. The kind I'd lived with my entire career. The difference was that now someone besides me would know it happened. When the briefing concluded, Markham escorted me to temporary quarters, a small room with military precision, tight corners on the sheets, a single window overlooking the tarmac, a desk with nothing on it but a lamp and a telephone. Ma'am. He paused at the door. The communications office wanted me to mention they've received several calls from a Jason Thompson in Phoenix. He's been trying to reach you through official channels. I sat on the edge of the bed. He's left messages, Markham continued. Apparently, he's been attempting to contact every military office he can find. The Pentagon switchboard has logged 16 calls in the past 4 hours. 16 calls? Jason, who had never called me once in his entire adult life, had called 16 times in 4 hours. What did he say? Markham consulted a small notepad. The messages are varied, several apologies, questions about how to reach you. One message where he apparently requested information about Air Force missile operations and was politely told that was classified. I almost smiled. There was also a call from a Richard Thompson. Markham's voice remained neutral. Your brother, I believe. He asked if you were safe. He asked how to talk to you. He asked, a pause. He asked if he'd lost you. I looked at the window. The runway lights blinked in steady patterns, guiding aircraft toward proper trajectories. Tell them I'm safe, I said finally. Tell them I'll be in touch when I'm ready. Yes, ma'am. Markham turned to leave, then stopped. Colonel, if I may. I waited. My father was career military, 30 years in the infantry. When he came home, he never talked about what he'd done. My mother thought he was keeping secrets from her. My sister thought he was cold. I thought... He cleared his throat. I thought he didn't trust us enough to let us in. I said nothing. He died when I was 22. After the funeral, I found his service records. I learned what he'd actually done, where he'd served, what he'd survived, why he couldn't talk about it. Markham's voice roughened. I spent years resenting his silence. Then I spent years understanding it. He met my eyes. Your family has a chance to understand now. It might take them time. It might take them longer than they think, but at least they have the chance. He left. I sat in the quiet room and listened to the aircraft landing outside, the roar of engines, the squeal of rubber on asphalt, the gradual silence as each plane found its place. The next morning, I checked my phone. 47 messages: Jason, 17, Richard, 12, Deborah, 8, various cousins and relatives whose names I had to scroll past to remember, 10. I read Jason's first. The early ones were panicked, typo-filled bursts of apology, explanations that explained nothing, promises to make this right without any understanding of what this meant. But the later messages shifted. Aunt Agnes, I've been up all night reading about missile operations. I found some declassified documents online. I had no idea. I had no idea what you people did down there. The pressure, the responsibility. I feel sick. I called Dad. He's worse than me. He's been pacing the house since you left. Mom says he hasn't slept. He keeps saying he should have asked. He should have asked years ago. I know you probably won't respond. I know I don't deserve it, but if you ever do, I want you to know that I'm sorry, not just for what I said yesterday, for every time I dismissed you, for every time I assumed my noise was more important than your silence. You saved 400 million people and you couldn't tell anyone. And I sat there mocking you while you ate 7-layer dip. I don't know how to make this right. I don't know if I can, but I'm going to try for the rest of my life if I have to. I set the phone down. Outside the window, a C-17 taxied toward the runway. Massive, patient, built for burdens most people never see. The Medal of Freedom ceremony took place on a Tuesday. I wore my dress uniform for the first time in 3 years. It still fit. I'd kept the same discipline with my body that I'd kept with everything else. The ribbons formed neat rows across my chest. The eagles on my collar gleamed under the White House lights. The president shook my hand and said words that I heard but didn't absorb. Something about courage, something about service, something about the quiet heroes who hold the line while the world sleeps unaware. The medal was heavier than I expected, cold against my palm. When the cameras flashed, I didn't smile. I stood at attention the way I'd stood 10,000 times before, in bunkers and briefing rooms and quiet quarters where the weight of civilization pressed down like the 200 feet of earth above my old duty station. General Holloway saluted. I returned it. 3 weeks after the ceremony, I drove back to Flagstaff. The cabin looked the same as I'd left it, small, sturdy, surrounded by the garden beds I'd built with my own hands. My neighbor had kept the dog fed and the plants watered. Everything was exactly where it belonged. I unpacked slowly, put the medal in a drawer where it would stay unless someone specifically asked to see it, changed into jeans and a flannel shirt, walked out to check on the tomatoes. They were coming along nicely. I knelt in the dirt, feeling the soil cool between my fingers, and breathed. Richard called that evening. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Agnes. His voice sounded older than I remembered. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I wasn't sure either. A long pause. I don't know what to say, he admitted. I've been trying to figure it out for 3 weeks. Everything sounds wrong. Too small. Too late. Then don't say anything yet. I watched the sun set over the pines. Just listen. Okay, you spent 30 years looking at me without seeing me. That hurt, Richard. It hurt more than I let myself feel because feeling it would have made everything harder. I had a job to do. I couldn't afford to be wounded by my own family. He made a sound, something between acknowledgement and grief. But I also made choices, I continued. I chose the silence. I chose to let you believe what was easier. I told myself it was classification, but some of it was just protection. Mine, yours, everyone's. Agnes, I'm not finished. I kept my voice steady. What I need you to understand is that I'm not the person you thought I was. I never was. The sister who did something with computers. She didn't exist. I made her up because the real version was too complicated, too heavy. I watched a hawk circle over the trees. If you want to know me now, you have to be willing to know all of it. The bunker, the key, the nights I couldn't sleep because I'd spent 12 hours ready to end the world. The silence that wasn't emptiness, it was everything I couldn't say pressing against my teeth. I want to know. Richard's voice cracked. Agnes, I want to know all of it. Then start by listening, really listening, not waiting for your turn to speak, not planning your response, just hearing what I actually say. A long silence. I can do that, he said finally. I can try. That's all I'm asking. Jason visited in April. He drove up from Phoenix in a rental car, looking thinner than he had at the Super Bowl party. The crypto t-shirt was gone, replaced by a plain blue button-down. He'd cut his hair. He stood in my driveway for a full minute before walking to the door. Aunt Agnes. His voice was quiet. Thank you for letting me come. I stepped aside to let him in. The cabin was small, a living room that doubled as everything, a kitchen barely big enough for two, a bedroom in back. Books lined every available surface. The metal sat in its drawer, invisible. Jason looked around like he was seeing a foreign country. You really live here, he said. Just here. No screens, no trading platforms, just quiet. I poured 2 cups of coffee. It took me a while to get used to it. After the bunker, everything felt too loud, too bright. I needed somewhere the world couldn't reach me. He accepted the coffee with both hands. I sold my portfolio, he said abruptly. Most of it. Kept enough to live on, but I couldn't look at those charts anymore. Every time I saw the numbers going up and down, I thought about what you said. About real risk, about holding something you can't cash out of. I sat across from him. I'm taking classes, he continued. Emergency management, disaster response, nothing like what you did, but something real. Something that matters whether or not the internet exists. He stared into his coffee. I spent 6 years thinking I was building something important. Turns out I was just moving numbers around while people like you actually held the world together. Jason. I waited until he looked up. What I did wasn't better than what you were trying to do. It was different. I had a specific set of skills in a specific moment in history. You're 29. You have time to figure out what yours are. His eyes were wet. I just want to be someone worth knowing, he said. Someone you'd be proud to call your nephew. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then be that person. Not for me, not for your father, for yourself. Summer came. The tomatoes ripened. I canned what I couldn't eat, gave jars to neighbors, watched the garden grow in ways that still surprised me after all these years. General Holloway called occasionally. Official check-ins disguised as social calls. She'd tell me about policy changes, about new protocols, about the young officers coming up through the ranks who'd read my file and wanted to understand. You're a legend now, she told me once, whether you like it or not. I didn't particularly like it, but I understood why it mattered. The young ones needed to know that the people who came before them had faced the same terrible choices, had sat in the same chairs, hands on the same keys, and made decisions that would echo for generations. They needed to know that the right choice wasn't always the easy one, that sometimes protocol was wrong and physics was right, and the only thing standing between survival and extinction was one person's willingness to say no. On the anniversary of the Kilo 11 incident, I drove out to the memorial, a small marker in a field that most people passed without noticing. No names, no dates, just a simple inscription for those who stood watch. I placed a small stone at its base, a tradition I'd learned from someone somewhere, a way of saying I was here. I remember. The wind moved through the grass. I thought about the bunker, the alarms, the 2 officers screaming at me to turn my key while the countdown clock ticked toward 0. I thought about the moment I'd said no, the moment I'd looked at the data and seen what they couldn't see, known what they couldn't know, and made a choice that could have ended my career or ended the world. I thought about the 26 years afterward, the silence, the garden, the family that didn't understand because I couldn't explain. And I thought about Jason back in Phoenix learning to respond to real emergencies instead of imaginary fortunes. About Richard calling every Sunday now, listening more than talking, about Deborah, who'd sent me a handwritten letter apologizing for every dismissive comment she'd ever made. They knew me now, not the whole story. Some things would stay classified forever, but enough. Enough to understand why silence wasn't weakness, why patience wasn't passivity, why the people who hold the weight of the world rarely talk about it. I stood at the memorial until the sun began to set. Then I drove home, where my garden was waiting, and my dog needed feeding, and tomorrow would bring another quiet day in a quiet life that had once held everything. The thing about silence is that it isn't always passive. Sometimes silence is the discipline that holds a civilization together. Sometimes silence is the space between a question and the answer that saves 400 million lives. Sometimes silence is what's left after you've done something so important that words would only diminish it. I work in my garden now. No title, no clearance, just Agnes, the retired aunt with the reading glasses and the tomatoes and the drawer full of medals she doesn't display. But sometimes when the wind moves through the pines and the evening settles over the mountains, I remember what it felt like to hold the key, to feel the weight of everything, to say no and mean it and live with the silence ever after. There is power in patience. There is freedom in truth, even if it comes late. I am no longer unknown, and the quiet at last is mine. If you enjoyed this story about quiet competence winning over loud arrogance, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching.